know how it is?
Do I have to, I must have to,
Oh, you have to share the screen.
sorry,
Thank you.
I thought I had shared it, there we go,
Okay.
there.
Can you see me now?
We'll find out.
And so with those changes, the Planning Commission again recommended 4-0 to recommend approval of those. So that's prepared in ordinance number 2021-03, which will be in your agenda for next week. Next slide. So recreational facilities. So the board approved phase 1 of this project last summer, where we created new standards for recreational facility development throughout the county. As part of that discussion, the Planning Commission said they wanted to take another look at what zones could handle additional recreational facilities. And so we as staff looked at the comprehensive plan, the Western Sub-Area Plan, Carson Plan, Swift Plan, and identified some areas where the comprehensive plans would support allowing additional recreational facilities, such as campgrounds, outdoor facilities, that type of thing. And we recommended some changes. The Planning Commission held a public hearing last month to recommend approval of those changes. Some of them were actually requested by county residents, so that was a good outcome for them. And so that is also on your agenda in ordinance 2021-04 for next week. So I did want to just bring that to your attention so you're not surprised when you see that on your agenda next week. All right, next slide. So, the next slide. Title 22 update. So this is a process that's been ongoing for several years. The Columbia River Gorge scenic area management plan update is what's why we're having this workshop, why we've been working on updating Title 22. But some background for the commissioners and for the audience. Scenic area was created by Congress in November 1986. So I think last week was the 35th anniversary of the Scenic Area Creation, actually. And part of the act requires the Gorge Commission to create a management plan, which includes, among other things, guidelines for development of land in the scenic area, and allows for the counties to implement those guidelines through adopting local land use ordinances. The management plan was first adopted in 1991, and Skamania County subsequently in July of 1993 adopted Title 22, and is one of 5 counties in the scenic area that has adopted a land use ordinance. The one county that has not is Columbia County. As the management plans updated or amended, we're required to update our Title 22 to maintain consistency with the management plan, and we've done that periodically over the years since the county first adopted it, again in 1993. Next slide. The management plan is required to be reviewed every 10 years and can be amended intermittently, but the last plan amendment was just completed, and that was a process that was initiated by the Gorge Commission and the Forest Service, which ended up with a new plan in October of 2020. The timeline at the bottom of the screen shows, this project started in 2016. There was a lot of public engagement at the beginning of the process, and then engagement with smaller technical teams, and then through 2020, the Gorge Commission had a lot of meetings discussing specific changes, and again, in October, adopted the final plan. They did have specific areas of focus, which included the scenic and natural resources chapters, as well as economic development, land uses, urban area boundary regions, and recreation chapters. The county did submit comments through various phases of the project, beginning with a comment letter from county staff with I think it was like a 10-page list of items that we wanted addressed. Later on in the process, the Board of County Commissioners sent a comment letter including your preferences, and the board even last year adopted a resolution opposing specifically some of the changes to the urban area boundary revisions. And there was a lot of engagement through their website notices and things like that early on, but this has been a long process, and while they solicited comments from the counties and county residents, I can't say that we were very successful in getting, our requests addressed. But, they did ask.
If I can ask a question.
Yeah.
Pardon me. Can you expand a little bit on the urban area boundary revisions?
Right, so what this really was policies for future revisions of urban area boundaries, specifically, the standards that the Gorge Commission would consider when responding to a request from a county to expand an urban area boundary. The city of the Dells was really kind of the city that was in focus as they were having these discussions, but we were definitely interested in them. And they, I don't have it in front of me, but they ultimately ended up with some different metrics that would limit their expansion. So I think it was 2% of the acreage or something like that. Pretty minor expansion.
And that was 2% of the urban area.
Right. And so that's where it ended up. And I think, we took a, pretty hard line opposition to that. The final thing we did actually was we sent a letter to the Secretary of Agriculture asking him to not approve the plan because of those concerns on the urban area boundary expansions.
It's been 30 years, and now the urban areas are starting to say, yeah, we're hitting what we think is our limit, so let's decide just what it is going to take to get an expansion of an urban limit.
And that was another question. When you talk about the Secretary of, the Undersecretary?
Agriculture.
Right. But wasn't the plan approved by Glenn Casamassa, the Forest Service?
Right, so that authority is deferred to the local regional forester.
Okay.
And that, I think the approval happened under the Biden administration. So it was took a little longer, I think, than was expected. Thanks. Okay, where are we? Next slide. So, the urban area boundary changes were certainly one of the things we didn't like the most, but those are not actually in Title 22. The management plan includes a lot of goals and policies, some of which don't apply to Skamania County, but what does apply are the land use regulations, and those are what are in Title 22. So there are a lot of changes that were made, but these are some of the key changes here, and there's a mix of ones that I think are positive and some that we don't feel so good about. One of them was to allow cideries in addition to wineries. So that's a land use that I could see, taking root out in Underwood, for example. There are existing standards requirements for wineries that cideries will not be able to follow. There's a change that would allow fruit and produce stands to sell additional products. So in the past, they were limited to selling products that were grown on the subject farm, and now they're able to sell other processed foods, so maybe jams that are made by someone in the area, or they can sell, souvenirs like, a ball cap or something that has their logo on it. And so that was, a change made in favor of economic development. And I believe Tamara Clausen, our Gorge Commissioner, was someone who was actually able to get that through towards the end of the process. There are new requirements for overnight accommodations. We touched on this briefly this morning. They're now explicitly allowed, but only in certain zones in the National Scenic Area. There's a limitation to 90 room nights per year, and there's also a limitation to the life of the permit being 2 years, so you have to renew that permit every 2 years. And that renewal is a little different than the annual renewal cycle that we're anticipating for our short-term rental permits outside the scenic area, because this would actually require new land use application and review process. And our reviews take 6 to 7 months, so that's a long process. So people should be thinking about, 18 months into their permit, think about renewing already. So again, the benefit there is they're now explicitly addressed. However, they're pretty strict standards. There's new standards for renewable energy systems, for things like wind and solar generation on properties, which is really consistent with what we've been doing already, but I think those are positive changes. But then there's some changes that are not so good, and these are things that our planning commission in particular took issue with. There's a revised agricultural income requirement for farm dwellings. So in certain zones, large-scale agriculture, special management agriculture, and special management forest, in order to have a dwelling, you need to have an agricultural use on the property, and the current code requires that you have $40,000 of annual income capability on that property. And that number's been in effect since the early 90s, and so the Gorge Commission has changed that number to $80,000 of annual income. And there's a little more accountability that's required now as part of that permit process. That's a pretty substantial increase, something that our planning commission did have some concern about whether or not that was something that was actually a realistic number. Our understanding is that's based on inflation, so the buying power of $40,000 in 1991 is roughly close to $80,000 today. But on top of this being $80,000 in 2020 dollars, it will increase annually based on inflation, so that number will continue to go up.
And that's gross income.
And that's correct. That's gross income. Another change that affects the development of dwellings is that the commercial forest and large woodland zones will no longer allow dwellings at all. So in the past, I think there was an agricultural income test there that doesn't apply anymore. You can't build a dwelling in that zone. You can maintain an existing dwelling, but can't build an existing dwelling. There's some revised tribal notice requirements. There's a little more work on our part to make sure that tribes are getting the notices. If we don't hear back from them, we're now required to follow up with them and invite them to comment again. If a project has a cultural resource survey requirement, we're going to notify them ourselves in advance of that survey being completed. Some of this is consistent with what we're already doing to an extent. Some of it's more strict in the sense that, we would often consult with tribes on applications already, and sometimes if we wanted clarification, we might follow up with them. But now on every time we don't get comments, we have to follow up with them. There are revised scenic compatibility requirements where there's a specific test now for a new building to determine whether or not it's compatible in terms of size and scale with nearby surrounding development. Similar to what we're doing, but a little more strict of a test. But the other side of that is that now projects with buildings that are 1,500 square feet or less are exempted from that. So that might be about even with what we're doing currently. And then there are 3 rivers that do have increased buffers from 100 feet to 200 feet. That's the Wind River, the Little White Salmon River, and the White Salmon River.
And again, those increases are only within the scenic area.
Correct. In those areas, as you think about where those are located, the scenic area boundary, a lot of that land is public land where those buffers are increased, but all the other buffers have remained the same, and in some cases are actually less than they are outside the scenic area, specifically for wetlands in the land. So there's no other changes to those standards. Next slide.
Yeah, I was just thinking on the Wind River, from the mouth of the Wind up to about the High Bridge is where you're talking. And most of the property up that stretch of the river is, like you say, public.
Right.
It's some private, but not a lot.
Well, and some of the private is in the urban area,
right?
On the west side. And then on the east side, down by Home Valley, there is some private land.
There is some.
They haven't been developed. In fact, I think Gunderson's one of the owners there.
Right.
He's done some fish habitat enhancement projects with the Underwood Conservation District.
Right.
So those increases don't appear to be the most impactful changes of those proposed. So we've taken all those changes from the Gorge Commission and have been working to update Title 22. The adoption of revisions is mandatory under the Scenic Area Act if we want to continue to administer Title 22 locally. We are allowed to make variations to those changes as long as they provide greater protection of resources. So going back to the short-term rental example, the Gorge Commission had some, basic limitations for what a short-term rental could be, and they said, but it's up to the county as to how you want to administer that. Well, only if we want to be more strict. And so that applies across the board. We have proposed some additional edits to the not to the management plan, but to Title 22, that I would say are not more strict, but at least as strict, or try to clarify some of the things that are in there. Next slide, please. And so this slide just includes a list of some of those proposed changes that staff has made. One big one is we're adopting a set of guidelines that would enable development of recreation resorts in the commercial recreation zone on industrial sites that basically apply specifically to the Broad and Mill property. SDS had pursued a plan amendment many years ago that was approved by the Gorge Commission, and for some reason or another, Skamania County actually never adopted that into Title 22, and we're proposing to adopt it into Title 22 at this time, which would enable commercial resort development on that site. We've made some other minor changes, so one example is we've added standards for hazard tree removal and water resource buffers. So, the management plan right now basically strictly reads that you can't make any disturbance within a water resource buffer, but we understand, there are occasionally times where you have a hazard tree in a buffer that, might fall over on a house or something like that, and property owners will reach out to us and ask, what do I do about this? And what we proposed is a policy in the code that would allow for hazard tree removal without going through a formal application process. So where, if the hazard is not apparent, they might have an arborist look at it, and then we have to mitigate the tree removal at 2-to-1 ratio, which is what we're doing already, but this would formalize that process. We've added a new definition for kitchen, which is actually a pretty important issue because a kitchen is basically how we make a distinction between a dwelling and an accessory building or any other building like that. And a lot of folks want things that are kitchens or things that are like kitchens, and so we've defined it pretty clearly so that this would enable you to have something like a kitchenette, but not a full kitchen, which is actually going to be a very useful tool for us. We've added a requirement for geotechnical reports on steep slopes, which is consistent with what we do outside the scenic area. Generally, in the NSA, you can't house on a 30% slope, but you can request a variance. We felt like, having a variance request along with a geotechnical report would actually help us, give us the confidence to approve projects in those areas. And then there's, a small change we're proposing to the expedited development review decision notice. So right now, with those projects, we're actually sending out the entire staff report, the entire decision to everybody within 500 feet of the property. And that actually takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money to do all that printing. So we're just proposing to issue a notice that the decision has been issued and make that available on our website. Next slide. So the update process is kind of a long one. It started with the Gorge Commission adoption. It went to the Secretary of Agriculture. Then it was transmitted to the counties, and this is where we're at. The Planning Commission made a recommendation. The Board of County Commissioners then has to decide whether or not to adopt. But from there, the process is not done. It goes to the Gorge Commission for their concurrence. Within 90 days of our transmittal to them, they will review it and determine whether or not the changes we've made are consistent with the management plan. Then it goes to the Secretary of Agriculture. So they have 90 days after the Gorge Commission's transmittal to them. So we're talking about 6 months out when the ordinance would finally become effective. Next slide. So the Planning Commission held a public hearing last Tuesday, and a lot of good discussion. Ultimately, we ended up with one recommendation, a 5-0 vote, to recommend approval of only those text amendments that were proposed by staff. So there were a couple slides. One was with the key changes. Those are the Gorge Commission mandated changes, and then the staff proposed changes. Those are also outlined in the staff report, which you all received a copy of. But essentially, they only want us to approve the staff-initiated changes and not those mandated by the Gorge Commission. There was a second motion that had a 3-2 vote, and that was to actually adopt the whole suite of changes, including the Gorge Commission mandated changes. However, the Planning Enabling Act, as well as our Planning Commission bylaws, do require that recommendations for text changes have the vote of no less than a majority of the Planning Commission, which would be 4 votes. So,
Alan, may I interrupt you, please? Sue Davis would like to be let in. She had to re-sign in. She was not signed in correctly. Maybe just wait until she's on. I'd appreciate that.
And Alan, would you be willing to re-say that? I guess I'm confused about the 2 different votes.
sure.
5-0 versus 3-2, and
Right. So there were 2 motions made at that meeting, and one vote was 5-0, and that was, again, to recommend approval of only those changes proposed by planning staff.
Okay.
So, the package basically includes those changes that are required by the Gorge Commission as part of Gorge 2020, and then some additional other things we did. And, I talked about a few key ones, but some of the other changes we made were style changes, typographical corrections, things like that. There's, I'd say, maybe not the majority of words, but, if you had a list of changes, the majority of those were actually proposed by staff. So that's what our Planning Commission's recommendation is only to approve staff changes. But there was
by that, it means only the staff changes, not the required
correct
changes from the Gorge Commission.
Correct. And there was a second vote of 3-2 to recommend approval of everything.
Is that contradictory or what? I'm seeing something.
So it's not, and the reason why is because that first vote, I think there were folks that voted for that who also would have supported and who ultimately did support adopting also the Gorge Commission required changes. Right. So essentially they kind of split it into 2 motions, and the second motion was to also include the Gorge Commission changes, and that was a 3-2 vote. And so while 3 is greater than 2, it's not sufficient for the purposes of forwarding a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners, because the Planning Commission's bylaws require a minimum of 4 votes on a motion for ordinance change. So a 3-2 vote would be enough to elect a chair to the Planning Commission, but would not be enough to say to the board, we want you to adopt the updated.
Okay, so to follow up on, pardon me, Commissioner Behar's comment, the first vote basically said we would recommend those things that forward. So we're not in concurrence to the other changes that were laid out.
Right, except that I agree those 5 votes would have supported them.
Okay, but that's that issue right now because that's the vote, right? Because it carries no weight.
Yeah, it's not a formal recommendation. Right. You don't have a recommendation.
Okay.
But I mean, isn't also dead weight in that even if they were to vote 4-2 the other way around, we still can't say no, right?
Well, I'll get to that question, but I think the recommendation, the only one that's on the screen, and the only one that is a formal recommendation, is to just approve staff's changes. But I don't want you to think that meant that all 5 of them would have only supported that. Right. There was definitely a split opinion on the Planning Commission. Some of the concerns that were articulated, and I think this is really important to understand where the Planning Commission came from. Specifically, I think, if there was one issue that I think probably everyone had concern with, or didn't like at least, is that $80,000 agricultural test question. Also, the fact that no new dwellings would be allowed in the commercial forest and large woodland zones. Obviously, there's a lot of little things, big and small, that the Planning Commission didn't like, but I think a big part of that really was the process, of feeling that county or the counties generally were not actively engaged in this weren't listened to or really asked to be part of the process, and that's based on, the outcome, not necessarily reflecting what the county would have liked to see here. Certainly, I think just a frustration maybe with the Gorge Commission in general. But another thing that was stated was that one of the planning commissioners stated that, they felt that it was really the Board of County Commissioners' responsibility to make this decision as elected officials. And, if you think about the Planning Commission's role and the distinction from the board's role, Planning Commission is, the commission that's supposed to develop land use policies, study out the issues, and make recommendations to the board about what the best land use policies are for the county. And, to that extent, them voting no, I think, it makes a little bit of sense that these are not the policies that they would forward as a planning commission, and they're the ones that, maybe even more than the Board of County Commissioners, are used to formulating those policies, right? So I think that's a little bit of, in my understanding of why they did this, and partially it's because they could, and they felt like it was important to express how they felt about the changes.
Right. I guess the other way to say it would be the Board of County Commissioners were answerable to the public, whereas the Planning Commission is kind of answerable to us in that they're an advisory board. Right.
And one of the planning commissioners who referred to the board as being elected officials, which I think, again, speaks to that level of accountability. Certainly, if the planning commission was given a task by the board to develop the bed zoning for this part of the county, you would end up with a different result, right? And again, I think that explains, at least to me, some of their thinking and why they voted this way. Next slide. So next steps, there's really a couple paths here, and they could, either one of them, end up in the same place. And so I'll have a suggestion for the board here, but if you adopt the Planning Commission recommendation as you have on most issues, staff would then prepare an ordinance, and that ordinance would take a little bit of time for us to do because we'd have to identify specifically those staff-only changes and separate those from the Board Commission changes. And the board could adopt that ordinance with only the local changes, and you can do that on a consent agenda at any time in the future. And I would ask for a few weeks to put together that work. If you wanted to adopt all the required changes, which is not what the Planning Commission recommended, then you would have to schedule a public hearing to consider that. We would then, as staff, prepare an ordinance, including all those changes, and the board would then hold a public hearing. At that public hearing, after the conclusion of that public hearing, you would normally make a vote as to what you wanted to do. You could, if you wanted to adopt everything, you absolutely have to hold that public hearing. But if you hold a public hearing, you could still decide to just go with the Planning Commission recommendation. And so my suggestion would be to hold that public hearing no matter what, and that gives you the option of voting one way or another, whether or not to go with the whole package or just do with the Planning Commission recommendation.
Okay. And by holding the public hearing, it opens it up to the public to make comment too.
Right. It's another opportunity to hear from your constituents.
Right.
And we haven't really heard a lot. We've had a lot of questions over the last few years about this process. As different issues came up, got a lot of input from people with different areas of interest. But at the public hearing we had with the Planning Commission last week, I think we had two comments. One was from a Gorge Commission staff member. The other one was from a Gorge staff member. So definitely nothing wrong with getting more public input.
Okay. Do you have another slide? Or?
Yeah, a few more slides.
Okay. Well, maybe.
But we can go back to this or discuss. There's I think three more here. Okay. I just want to talk about what implementing Title 22 means for the county. Again, we're one of 5 that have chosen to do this. And so in Skamania County, all non-federal developments are reviewed by the Community Development Department, not by the Gorge Commission. So applications are submitted to the county, reviewed by the county, and the county staff member issues a decision on that application. Next slide. You know, so why does it make sense to maintain consistency? Ultimately, it's because it allows us to maintain local control of administration of Title 22. There's a lot of benefits from that. First, on this list is, you know, having that local knowledge of the area, being that, you know, we only work within Skamania County. Mike almost works only exclusively within the scenic area. So we know the area. When someone calls about a property and says, hey, I'm looking at this piece of land on this road, we've been there, we've been pretty close. We know what it looks like. We probably know the zoning, and we also have a sense of where that property is visible from. And so we're able to provide a level of customer service that, you know, I don't think, you know, the Gorge Commission could compete with. You know, we're providing the local services for residents, meaning that, you know, they're coming into Stevenson to drop off their application to pick up their permits. We're able to control our level of service. And so that's part of the accountability to the public that the commissioners have, is if we're not turning applications around quickly enough, you can add more funding and have more staff members do that work. Where if another agency, say the Gorge Commission, were in charge of this process, you know, whatever staffing they have is the staffing they have, and we as accountants couldn't make them hire more people and provide better service to our residents.
But that word control is kind of funny. I mean, I guess I can see that we would control the level of customer service.
Right.
We're not really controlling what we authorize and not authorize. You know, this Title 22 is kind of telling us what to do. We're just kind of the
We do have local interpretation.
Yeah, I'd say to an extent that the next thing is the local decision making and discretion. And that doesn't mean that you know, we can approve houses that are light in color and not earth tone that go against, you know, specifically what the code says. But we have that ability to make, you know, local interpretations on specific issues. And sometimes it's not exactly, you know, an interpretation of what the code says. It's also what we see on the ground. And I think it's fair to say that we've reached different decisions than our counterparts at the Gorge Commission or even other counties might have. That's not to say that they're right or that we're wrong or the other way around. It's just, I think part of it is that local accountability, which is the last thing on this slide here, is, you know, we have an incentive to work with property owners and to an extent assist them along in that process. And sometimes, you know, the answer is no, and you could turn them away and say, no, you're denied, or you can work with them through that application process to figure out a solution that works for them. And so I think as a result of that, you know, we're getting better results from applicants, and our decisions are, you know, basically all approvals, because we're letting people know up front that no, this isn't going to work, right? Or we're you know, helping them change and redesign the project.
But to be clear, you know, there's this overall regulation, and we as a local county, we have a little teeny bit of flexibility down here with some of the particulars, but not with the big picture.
Right. The rules are going to be the same across the board. It's some of that discretion that, you know, any decision maker ought to have and has. Again, I think it's fair to say that we've reached different conclusions than other agencies may.
They're just minor,
very minor things, right? Mm-hmm. And it could be that the ultimate project decision is an approval, but you know, our house might look a little different here, or we might spend a little bit longer reviewing the application to get to a good result that works. But again, ultimately, there's local accountability, and that accountability, you know, between the county and its residents, but also county staff and the commissioners. Once you lose that, and that's pretty important.
And I guess for me, you know, I've appreciated, you know, when I've come down and talked to you with the notion that somebody comes in and says, hey, can I do this? And we don't just say, no, you can't do it and send them out the door. We say, no, you can't do it this way, but if you do this or this, you can do it. So I've kind of appreciated that kind of level of customer service to help. But I think the bigger picture is starting to weigh on me and ache in my soul a little bit, just
Yeah, understood. Next slide, I think, we can address some of this. The alternative is implementation by the Gorge Commission. So again, those overarching rules, they're the same whether you're in Columbia County and are applying to the Gorge Commission for your scenic area application, or whether you're in Multnomah County or Skamania County. It's all the same. The difference here is if we didn't have Title 22 and we're doing, like Columbia County is, applicants would actually need to apply for scenic area permits through the Gorge Commission. And again, that means traveling to White Salmon, and maybe that's not the biggest deal, but they also have to work with Skamania County too. The Gorge Commission doesn't do everything. They just give you your scenic area permit. You'd still have to get a building permit from Skamania County, water permit, septic permit. And I don't even know what that process would look like, and would we have some other zoning rules too that we had to apply? Would our critical areas code start applying here or not? And so, part of that change in service is that now you're asking folks to go to two different offices, and we'd have to communicate with the Gorge Commission to make sure that we're not approving building permits until the Gorge Commission's approved something. You'd have to coordinate final inspections between Skamania County for building and the Gorge Commission for the scenic area part of it. And we lose control over the customer service. Permit timelines would likely take a longer time. Appeals would go directly to the Gorge Commission rather than our hearing examiner, and ultimately the same standards would apply, but we lose our discretion, our ability to interpret and apply the standards, and then that control over the level of service. So, I don't know exactly what happens if we only adopt some of these changes. I would hope that there'd be some dialogue with the Gorge Commission about how to, ultimately end up in a situation where Skamania County can continue to administer Title 22 locally. But if not, then there would be some sort of process where we have to hand that back to the Gorge Commission.
So, I mean, if we were to not to deny it, we would basically revert back to the position of Clickitat County.
I think so.
That's a reasonable
That's an
description.
assumption that we would probably
Okay. All right.
move to.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah. He's been fighting with Clickitat County this morning, and now suddenly we would be in the same boat that they're in.
And there's other implications as far as like grant
Okay.
funds and things like that.
Can we go back to 13?
13?
Please. Okay. So, for me, cutting to the chase, we've got two outcomes here.
Right.
Either we take the one, pardon me, on the left end, support the initial vote of our board that was 5-0 to only accept ours, right? And that puts us crossways with the commission. Or we take the other route, and also, I'm sorry, taking the first one, we also would stand to lose funding for our portion of local management. So the first question there is, does that funding totally cover our costs relative to the gorge?
Yes, so I'd say that funding, it's substantial. So we're looking at $195,000 annually from the Department of Commerce, and then our scenic area permit fees are probably around $35,000 is what's in the budget. So looking at $230,000, and that absolutely covers every penny. It's not just salaries. It's and, we do this quarterly to figure out how much. What percentage, for example, of our electric bill was spent on scenic area work? What percentage of our printing?
Okay.
Every penny is covered by that.
Right. Okay.
I'd also like to interject that it would put the Washington Investment Board in instant limbo if we were to not put on this.
If we would what?
If we weren't to adopt Title 22. So Skamania County's loan programs would be in limbo by not recognizing the act anymore. So we could lose $2 billion in loan funds. So I was telling Bob yesterday, I said, as the EDC director, of course I'm anti-gorge commission, but when you're in this role, you have to take with what you're given. And unfortunately, I've seen the success of the money that we've been given time and time again to be able to help our businesses and our government agencies, which have all borrowed from this money. So it's not just affecting the residents, it would also affect the government agencies. But it would strip it from the EDC pretty quickly.
Okay, so moving forward, right, what is the next step?
Well, the next steps up to the board to determine, you know, I wouldn't say you have to decide which one of those two routes you want to take. It's really a question of, you know, are you absolutely comfortable with just going with the Planning Commission's recommendation? Because all that takes is saying, put it on an agenda. Or do you want to schedule a public hearing? There's a public hearing notice included in the agenda for this meeting for you to schedule a public hearing on December 14th. And the outcome of that hearing is up to the board. I mean, you can go either path. It's just that you must hold that hearing to even consider adopting everything. One final thing I'll add is, you know, if there's a conversation to be had about whether or not to maintain Title 22 and maintain, it's really a question of maintaining local administration. And I think that's a valid conversation to have, but that's probably one that if you were serious about it, you know, I would suggest, you know, being very thoughtful about it and you know, it'd take months to explore all the issues and figure out how you would wind down this process. Because, you know, the Gorge Commission has one staff member that's doing development reviews, and that's definitely not enough for Skamania County. And, you know, if that was the outcome you wanted, I would say take the time to make that transition and figure out how we could, you know, take that funding, which we would lose, and maybe transfer that to the Gorge Commission. Because if that money's out there, you know, I would want that to be spent on Skamania County residents, even if that meant that funded a Gorge Commission staff member. The point being, though, there's a lot to think about, and I think, you know, to wind this process down and have a smooth transition is really important if that's where you go. So if that is what the board wanted to do, you know, let's keep doing what we're doing now while we figure out what that transition looks like.
Could I, well, Cindy has something, but I'll go first. I'm just trying to get a fine tuning here with what Kevin said. By us rejecting the Gorge Commission's regulations, that's not the same thing as not recognizing the scenic area, is it? Or is it?
You're in essence not going with the act anymore.
I mean, is that how click attack? I mean, because it seems like, from what I understand, I'm ignorant, but click attack isn't doing any of this, but they're still regulated by the Gorge Commission, right?
That's exactly what would happen with us.
Yeah.
But so how is that not recognized?
It's federal law, so they've shunned the, sorry.
No, you're fine.
They've shunned the Gorge Commission, but the Gorge Commission still has to, because it's federal law, they still have a say in every development that goes on within the scenic area. So we would essentially be saying, because this is just the amendment to their policies, basically. And so us saying we don't agree with your amendment, well, they're saying, well, that is the act. So if you don't like it, then you're not agreeing with the act now. And that's.
But you're cut loose.
So you're cut.
So
But you're
basically,
really not cut loose. I mean, if you're
Well,
cut
you're not.
loose.
No,
But you're back to Clickitat County standard.
Right. So one of the things that I would imagine would happen is that the service in getting people what they need to do what their limited rights allow them to do would be slow.
Oh,
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the immediate effect,
Right.
is the timeline.
so if you're a property owner in Prindle and you needed to develop your lot, you would have to go probably to White Salmon to get your permits.
Well, and the staff would reside, you know, out of that office.
Right.
Right.
I'm sorry, Cindy, you had a.
Oh,
Well, I just wanted to say that I was one of the three that voted to adopt all of the changes. And the reason I did that, even though I am opposed to a lot of the changes that are recommended, and I feel with you, Richard, as a resident here for close to 30 years, the ache in your soul, I think, is shared by many who've had to cope with the Scenic Act. But I also recognize that I think the place to affect changes about and within the Scenic Act is really at the Planning Commission or the Gorge Commission level. And so I don't necessarily have a solution on how to do that moving forward, but it does mean becoming more engaged on the Gorge Commission, with the Gorge Commission, paying attention to the appointees, and doing a fair bit of more lobbying within the Gorge Commission. Of course, that requires a lot of energy to affect our voice, to make that stronger, maybe a little more coordination with other counties and how they're feeling about these planning changes. Maybe not at staff level, but maybe at volunteer level, like planning commissioners, and to have a seat at the table. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. I would hate to see us lose local control of it. I think that Alan and his staff are incredibly competent and have done a great job and come a long ways with helping people to work within the Scenic Act. So that's just my thoughts on it, that I really feel that we need to affect a solution moving forward at the Gorge Commission level. And although I understand the need to make a statement.
But it seems like that's all. I mean, didn't we write a letter of concerns and submit it to the Gorge Commission?
Yeah, I think there were at least two.
2 letters?
Yeah, there was.
And did they just bow and say, yeah, everything you want, you get, or?
Well, no, right? So I think there were some things that came out of that were positive, and the overnight accommodation, short-term rental things, it's a win to the extent that they're acknowledged as a use that's out there. Another thing that was asked for by us was accessory dwelling units, and this is another issue where we know that they're out there, and it's an enforcement issue for us, and we think that there's reasonable ways to mitigate impacts of accessory dwelling units. But we didn't get those. There wasn't really a lot of discussion. I mean, it was at the meeting where they discussed it, and they just said no. But that's something that, I'd like to continue to keep pushing for. But I think, what Cindy's talking about here is something that we really haven't done. We certainly didn't do during this process. And we didn't bring our planning commission in right away. And we worked and talked with other counties, and we shared some ideas and concerns. But, we sent them a 10-page letter with, probably 100 or more issues. A more effective way would probably be to do what the Friends of the Gorge are doing, which is, consolidating and getting a bunch of people with the same interest together and saying, okay, here's 3 things we want you to look at. And, maybe next time that's what we ought to do. I think, this is probably not going to be for 10 more years, but that's something that there's a long game there and figuring out how to do this. And it's not something that I think Skamania County can do on its own.
Right. This is a cycle that every 10 years we're going to be back at the negotiating table.
Sue would like to comment when she gets an opportunity. Okay.
I guess, I appreciate what Cindy said about you and your staff, and I agree that you guys are great, but I guess this ache in my soul is evolving to the point of thinking, well, and this might sound a little crass, but it's almost like you guys are making people feel comfortable under the tyranny of the Gorge Commission. And it's like, I don't know, I'm struggling with this.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that the customers we have countywide, but I'd say particularly within the scenic area, are happy with the level of service that they're getting from us.
Are happy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think you guys do great. But it doesn't change the bigger stuff.
I think what I'd say is I feel like those in the scenic area who have their house approved, and once they get their approval and they get their certificate of occupancy, really don't have a lot of issues with the rules because they pretty well protect your surroundings. And if you like things the way they are when you move in, the scenic area is a good way to to protect that, right? So, I can't speak for everyone in the scenic area, but I do think the applicants that we're currently getting, a lot of them are drawn to the scenic area because of what it is. And,
yeah, but they do arbitrary, it seems arbitrary when they increase buffer sizes on your property. They don't even give you a public notice, and, they keep people from expanding a little on their metal roof that they're not even really in a key viewing area, but
as a person who actually lives in the scenic area and has developed property in the scenic area, it actually works quite well. And it does act as a means of making sure there's some consistency in a neighborhood or in the area that you live, that you don't see things happening that you don't want to have happen. Yeah.
Kind of like an HOA on steroids.
Well, you guys have more restrictions in the homeowners association as far as vehicles that you can park on your property.
But that's because that's what we want.
Right. But again, like Alan said, a lot of people who live in the scenic area are appreciative of the fact that there are some regulations on what's occurring within the scenic area.
Well, there definitely, there's issues with the regulations. I think, what I'm hearing and what I've heard from the Planning Commission is the major issue is the way this is all set up, and the fact that we don't have much of a say in what the regulations are within the scenic area, and the Planning Commission doesn't get to plan. And so, there are legitimate concerns, and I think there's ways to express those concerns, and I think it's important to express them. But ultimately, I think it's up to the board to determine what the best way to do that is.
Sue, I think you're waiting for
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So I had a couple things I wanted to share, and one is that the scoping meetings began for this plan update back in 2016, and so it's my understanding that going forward, it's not a 10-year wait to reinitiate this process. So now that we can see that there is a collective will to give firmer, stronger, more unified feedback to the Gorge Commission about what we see that we don't like. If we are organized around doing that, and we understand that the Gorge Commission may very well begin another round of updates very shortly, and I think that is the case, and I think it could be if a community such as this one advocates for that, I think that the Gorge Commission could be responsive to that very quickly. And so I would just like to offer that as a possible outcome here, knowing that I'm in favor of adopting all the Title 22 changes as they're written. I do see that there is a path forward that both allows us to not upset the apple cart entirely and pushes us into a better position for advocacy for what Skamania County residents would like to see. And it does seem clear that there are some significant concerns about the way the management plan came out this time. But I also want to note that there were many public notices of opportunities to engage. And I would just reiterate what Cindy said, which is that is the place where there is a built-in opportunity for people to engage with the process and to push on the issues that they feel really concerned about. And then I have one final just clarification, and it's that by voting unanimously 5-0 to adopt the local changes that were suggested by our planners, my intent in that vote was not to say only adopt those changes. If that was the interpretation, and it sounds like in this conversation that is how that's being interpreted, I would just like to say my intent was to vote yes, adopt all those changes, but that doesn't mean only those changes. And I hope that that's a useful clarification. It may well not be, but thank you for letting me comment.
Thank you.
With that.
And I think, the second vote obviously reinforces what you've said. Part of my problem since I've become engaged in county government is the ability for counties to be at the table to the extent that other nonprofit groups are, is hugely not there. The capacity to be there, you know, there's just too many irons in the fire. You know, and so I would encourage anyone listening to begin to work with the Gorge Commission. And maybe we need to have a more robust conversation with the Planning Commission on specifics for this. You know, I'm caught between a rock and a hard place. You know, one just smells a little worse than the other, if you will, for me. So I can understand, and I do appreciate the work that you people have done. I appreciated hearing that the vote was 5-0 and having the explanation for that, and also, you know, the incredible work that our Planning Commission has done. So, you know, I'm curious what, you know, the next step is to move to another public meeting.
So it would be, yeah, so the next, what we'd like is I think that we would need a motion to schedule that public hearing, and that was in your meeting packet, a public hearing notice for December 14th.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah, and, okay.
and it would be for, December 14th.
Yep.
Make a call for motion.
And I'm willing right now to go ahead and make that motion.
Do you want to return to the room, or
Pardon me?
gonna wait for Richard
Yeah,
to read?
I'll wait for Richard, though. Everyone's aware. Because without going through the process of opening it up to the public and continuing it, I know there are some feelings that we'd like to be able to say, we like what our staff has done, but we don't want to have to deal with the rest of the world. But that's not the, you know, the way that we're going to resolve some of our longer standing issues.
All right, Richard, we're looking for a motion to
And
move forward with a public hearing in December.
so I would like to make the motion to set the public hearing for December 14th to consider ordinance 2021-05, amending Title 22 to bring Skamania County's National Scenic Area Ordinance into consistency with recently adopted amendments in the management plan for the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area.
I'll second that.
All in favor, say aye. Or
Aye.
is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. We have set the date of December the 14th for a public hearing, and I think with that, that concludes our business for today. If there are no further comments.
Did you send us these slides already, or
No, I don't think so, but I
can you?
Yeah.
Okay. And I just want to say, I commend you. It's a pretty well organized thing. Did you put this all together yourself?
But, yeah.
Sometimes I just think you're brilliant beyond imagination.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know that.
All right, with that, happy Thanksgiving. We're adjourned.